Thank you all for joining us here this Thursday morning. It's Thursday morning on the West Coast here. I know we've got people from all over the world, all different time zones. So excited for this training-centric webinar that we'll be hosting today. We'll just give it another minute or two while we wait for more folks to join. Excited to be sharing this content with you guys. This is a really exciting and new area. Well, relatively new. It's actually been kind of a central area of the simulation industry for many years. But we'll be sharing a little bit of the insights that we've gathered over the last couple of years into this, the major changes that have occurred with the advancements of recent technological breakthroughs and some of the techniques and key components of different VR training applications. So really excited. We're about a minute in here, so I'm going to give it just another couple more minutes. Almost ready to start. All right. Okay. We'll probably have a couple more people filter in the next couple minutes, but given that we're on a little bit of a, trying to keep this tight, we'll get started right now. Welcome everyone to another WorldViz webinar. If this is your first time joining us, thanks for coming. If you're a return visitor, we're excited to have you back. I'm going to go ahead and just introduce our speakers, our panelists today. We've got Matthias Pusch, our CEO and VP Sales and Marketing. He's a co-founder of WorldViz, former McKinsey consultant, material scientist by background. We've also got Andy Beall, PhD, chief scientist, principal co-founder of WorldViz, whose work goes all the way back to the early 90s with VR. And we've got Felix Rudert, who is one of our primary development engineers for our hardware solutions. He is the product manager of our VizMove hardware systems. And then we've got Seda Rabouti, who is our Vizard product manager and a solutions architect here. So he's going to speak more on the software side. My name is Dan Tinkham. I am the head of sales for the Americas, and happy to be your host today. I'll be kind of our moderator. And without further ado, let's jump right in. So here are the topics we'll be covering today. The first one is, why is VR an effective training tool? This is going to be covered in detail by Andy Beall. He's going to give us some of the scientific basis for why VR makes such an interesting and compelling training tool. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the industries that are currently leveraging VR, both the established ones and the more emerging areas. And I'll talk a little bit about the methodologies for creating different VR scenarios as well. So getting into 360 versus computer-generated, and where you might apply one or the other. After that, we'll have Seda Rabouti come in with more of a deep dive on the key components of what makes a effective VR training application. And then we'll have a live demo with Felix Rudert at our tech lab in Santa Barbara, where he'll be giving a full mixed reality demo using our projection system and a fire extinguisher to put out a virtual fire. So that'll be pretty exciting. Felix is also going to be showing some different hardware systems, giving you guys a little bit of an idea about how these different components work and when you might leverage one over the other. After that, we'll hand it over to Matthias for the considerations of the future of VR training, some of the emerging technology that we'll see in the next couple of years. And then throughout this entire way, if you guys haven't done this before with us, what we like to do is we take your questions throughout the webinar, and then we actually are live putting them in at the end of the presentation. So stick around after the main presentation, and we'll actually be giving a pretty detailed Q&A where we'll go in, we'll answer your questions in detail. We really like to actually kind of take a little bit of time there at the end to make sure that we're addressing the questions that are coming up during the presentation. So stick around for that. There'll also be a survey that's sent out at the end of the webinar, and we'd love to get your feedback, any questions you guys have that we might not have answered, and we'll be certain to follow up with you guys in detail afterwards. So please, at any time, just submit your questions. Just as a heads up, housekeeping, everyone's muted, so it's just going to be the WorldViz folks talking, but we are definitely taking your questions. Submit anything. If you guys are having any issues, just let us know. So let me go ahead and jump in here. WorldViz has been doing the VR world since 2002, and our technology actually goes back into the early 90s, where it was originally funded by a DoD grant. So this is an area that we've been working in for almost 30 years collectively. Early on, when systems were very expensive based on military style components, we were one of the only companies in the world that was producing fully integrated VR systems. So that was kind of our original start back in the day. Obviously, some of our first customers were NASA, Lockheed Martin, some of the big sort of aerospace areas where we were helping build simulations, things along those lines. But we also have a really strong background in the academic world. So creating psychology experiments, things like that. And that's actually where a lot of our early technology and early research was focused. Just to give you guys a little bit of insight into what we do, this is going to be a very generic presentation, so it's not going to be focused on our product specifically, but just so that you have an idea of what our background is. We maintain two software programs. One is a fully drag and drop multi-user collaboration software called Visible. The other is a Python-based, research-focused simulation engine that is called Wizard. Many of you guys who are working with us will be familiar with either one of those tools. We also, and this is something that I think you'll see a lot today, have our own in-house development team. So we have our own development studio in-house. We do a lot of content development for different customers, and a lot of that is actually training related these days. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, our methodologies, what we have internally as our team for those pieces. And then also, which is what's going to be more Felix's domain when he gives the hardware demo, we do integrate hardware pieces. We have our own proprietary motion tracking system and some software related to that. But we also are really getting in on all of the different consumer pieces. So we really have an opportunity to see all the emerging things like data gloves, eye trackers, biofeedback. And as a company, we put those together into fully integrated systems. So it's a pretty cool space to be in, where we get to see really a whole overview of all the different hardware and software pieces that are coming out in the VR space. So a little bit of background there on us. Without further ado, let's jump into the topic of the day, which is VR training. I just wanted to give a little bit of context here before we jump in. So we mean VR training to be any kind of a simulated teaching environment. So simulation meaning an immersive space generated by a computer, either graphics or video. So usually, but not always, it's going to require immersive hardware, some kind of headset that goes onto a user's head, maybe a multi-user situation where there's multiple people in headsets together, or a 3D projection system where you can actually have multiple users joining and seeing the same simulation simultaneously through a projected image on a wall or on a screen. So anywhere where you've got some kind of interactivity in a virtual world and you're doing training or learning, that's really what we mean by VR training. Why you might want to use VR training. This allows businesses to accelerate onboarding. You save money at scale, and you're also providing a consistent experience for all of your trainees. One of the really cool things that Andy's about to speak to in detail is that VR allows you to learn by doing instead of learn by watching. So traditional learning methods where you're sitting on a computer and going through a PowerPoint presentation or a pre-recorded seminar, VR really puts a person in what we would call an ecologically valid, close to real life situation, because you're simulating the actual environment that they would be in, whether that's a dangerous environment or really a more mundane one. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hand it over to Andy, and Andy's going to jump in here and give us a little bit of information on the sort of scientific basis for why it's such a cool space to be working in. All right, Andy, hand it over to you now.
All right, thank you, Dan. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir when I say that none of us believe rote learning is the ultimate goal of any training program. But it can sometimes be difficult to break out of the trap of rote programs and deliver truly meaningful training. I'm also going to guess that less than half of the audience here is already using VR for training, and that most of you are enticed at the prospect, but are looking for deeper understanding and a justification for launching a VR training program. So before jumping into the many technicalities of VR that we will do throughout this webinar here, let me start by saying that VR by itself doesn't protect a training program from poor execution. So unless the investment is made to build a training program beyond rote learning goals, then VR will end at rote learning, and you'll be stuck giving your trainees no ability beyond information recall. Now, while information recall is critical for many tasks, it's a long way from giving your trainees the ability to solve new problems, what's partly meant by meaningful training. So let's unpack meaningful training a bit. Training that is beyond rote learning and beyond the ability to recall information. After recall, next comes understanding, which is generally understood to be the ability to absorb material and build connections. Sorry, I was getting some noses. Everything's okay, it looks like. Understanding is the ability to absorb material and build connections from different modalities. So you can read material, you can hear material spoken to you verbally, watch a video. You can identify the underlying threads and interconnect that information. Apply is the ability to execute and implement the information and the understanding you have to solve basic problems. Analyze is the ability to break information into its constituent parts, to essentially differentiate different information components, organize that information cognitively, focus on particular components. Evaluate is when you have enough knowledge and capability to start forming judgments, both quantitative and qualitative judgments on the information that you've been trained. And lastly, create is when you can essentially put all the information together and start to build original product. So how is VR unique in its ability to provide meaningful training? For the most part, VR is not unique in its ability to provide meaningful training. But too often, traditional venues of training programs fail to do what VR can do so easily. So let's look at what some of these very easy capabilities of VR are. First, as Dan mentioned, learn by doing. VR is truly an in situ, a natural way to put somebody into a situation where they can reach out and start to interact and articulate with the environment around them. It's also one of the most powerful mediums for evoking a sense of presence. It's rare that somebody in a VR system doesn't remark on the surprise of feeling like they are at a different location in the field that's known as presence. And that can be used and leveraged for many interesting results. For instance, you can place somebody into a highly stressful, fast-moving situation and truly evoke emotional experiences. You can get somebody's biophysiological responses starting to overload. And it goes as just part of the technology that will be shown later in this webinar, that this is an inherently 3D, so depth-rich environment with 3D sound. So you truly are hitting somebody with a multimedia experience. In summary, VR is naturally experiential. You're placing somebody into not just a database, but you're placing somebody into a lifelike situation, allowing them to leverage everything that they have grown up doing with normal worlds, normal environments to learn from. VR environments are complex, but without being complicated, meaning they can have deep structure, deep features that can be explored and utilized by the trainee without being overly complicated to understand or to start to interact with. I will now turn this back over to my colleague, Dan. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. So this is the time for our first poll. I'm going to go ahead and send that poll out now. We really like to get a sense of our audience, so where everybody's coming from. This is really helpful for us to kind of tailor the presentation a little bit more towards, the majority representation. I see some answers coming in here now, which is fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Going to leave this up for just a minute longer, and then I'll go ahead and publish it so you guys can all see. These are just our main areas where we would say, it's kind of hard. One of the cool things about VR is that it touches so many different industries. It's what makes it such an exciting space to work in. But we do our best to try and narrow it down to the 5 main categories that we see. So if you feel like you're underrepresented here, sorry about that. We can't fit them all in a simple multiple choice form. Looks like that's about everybody. I don't think we've got any more coming in, so I'm just going to go ahead and publish this with you guys. So not a huge surprise that the majority of folks are coming from the academic research side and virtual learning. This is a space that we work in quite a bit. Architecture, engineering, and construction is also a traditional area, but really more on the design review side. And then industrial and manufacturing, which, is a little bit more of a catch-all for folks who are working in the service industry and things like that. Healthcare, obviously huge these days, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in detail. I think a lot of interest in how we can all kind of figure out new ways of learning and new ways of doing in this new reality that we exist in is absolutely at the forefront of many people's minds. So thank you, everybody, for coming in, giving us your poll results. I'm going to jump into a little bit more of my section here. So this is just a really brief overview of the industries that we see VR training being applied these days. And just for the simplicity of sort of addressing this topic, I've broken it into established and emerging areas. So let's take a look at the established areas first. Established areas kind of goes without saying that defense and aerospace are the sort of early adopters of this technology, the early drivers of this technology. If we think about flight simulators and now, multi-user headset simulators, this is a space that we've seen really this technology be pushed. And many of the early headsets that we used ourselves internally back in the early 2000s were all, made for the defense simulation industry. After that, oil and gas. And this is also another kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of the VR training arena, because many of these scenarios are fairly dangerous scenarios, ones where a person might be exposed to heavy machinery, heavy equipment. We've in the past built many custom controllers so that you can control a derrick or a crane in a live scenario where, there's a lot to risk. And you really don't want to put a person into a simulation or into an environment that has such high risk factors without going through some kind of really sophisticated training ahead of time. So those 2 areas, because you're really talking about, high cost and high risk factors, have been using virtual reality type applications for training for many years. Another one would be manufacturing and industrial for many of the same kind of reasons, training folks on how to use heavy machinery, familiarizing them with a new facility, taking them through some kind of introduction to how they might be using expensive equipment. All of those are really clear use cases for why you'd want to use virtual reality. You're really putting them in situ, as Andy was telling us just now. The fourth one, maybe a little surprising to you all, but sports training. This has been around for many years. If you even think about the kinds of golf simulators that you might encounter, and then nowadays we're actually putting people into simulated sports environments as well, which is a really pretty cool area actually for many folks, even though sadly we are living without sports these days. But we can put a headset on and remember the good times. So emerging areas, healthcare, I think, it's a little bit debatable whether this is emerging or not. It's definitely been around for a long time. You've got your kind of medical dummy, as you see here, and having these mixed reality experiences where you're combining physical medical dummies and virtual overlays is an exciting kind of new area that we're seeing a lot of interest in these days. We'll be showing a little bit of a clip of this actual surgery simulation that we built a few years ago, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what a more complex computer-generated environment looks like. But the newer areas that we're definitely seeing are retail and service industry. So places where there's a huge workforce. So scaling up a sophisticated training program has a very high benefit. And for the first time, with these workforces of 10,000, 100,000, even up to 1 million people, in the past, the barrier to entry was really just the hardware itself was so expensive. But now that you've got these lightweight devices, even the more sophisticated PC-based ones are really affordable these days, you're able to reach a larger audience. So deploying these types of training applications at scale is actually starting to make financial sense. So it's a really exciting space to be seen. Health and safety, this is, again, a little bit more of a catch-all, but one of the more popular training applications we've seen in the past is things like active shooter simulations. So really simulating, just as Andy was saying, these kind of high emotional environments, things that we hopefully will never have to encounter. But if you actually have a memory and emotional impression of this event ahead of time, just in case something terrible was to happen, to be able to return to that memory and have it imprinted upon you, a lot of value there. So these are the kind of emerging areas that we're seeing in the VR training world. Obviously, this isn't comprehensive, and we're not going to catch everything right now, but just wanted to give you guys a little bit of an idea of where it currently stands. I'm going to jump in now. My colleague Sato is really going to be talking a lot more about this in detail, but I just kind of wanted to separate the two main methodologies for virtual reality application development in the training sector. And that's really fully video-based, and then fully computer-generated based, and then our favored path, which is a little bit more of a middle path. And I'll explain that a little bit in more detail soon. What's really cool about 360 video, which I think probably most people have experienced, you can actually just jump on YouTube right now, and many YouTube videos are actually full surround videos that you can look around in. But 360 video, it offers an opportunity to just put a camera down in a space and capture that environment for a future training. And while that sounds very easy, there are some difficulties there. Obviously, if you've ever done any kind of video production, to create a high quality video production is challenging enough. To create a surround video production has its own separate and unique challenges. There's 180 cameras and 360 cameras, but really the idea is to be able to quickly create a simulated environment. The limitations kind of down the line with a camera-based experience are that, one, your head is really locked in the position of where the camera originally was. Any type of edit that you might want to make is going to require a reshoot. The types of interactivity that you have are really limited to sort of user interface overlays. So any kind of CGI like menu that might come up, but you're not going to be able to reach out and grab something in the recorded world. So those are the kind of limitations. One of the really nice things about 360 is that it's very easy to deploy across multiple devices, right? So you can put it on a cell phone. You can put it on a Google Cardboard, which, isn't really great, but is sort of very low basic level of VR engagement. You can put it on these more lightweight devices like the Oculus Go. So it's really a nice way to create content quickly, but has some obvious limitations. On the other hand, we have CG. So CG, just in this case is computer generated. This is actually a photogrammetry rig, so it's creating a computer generated image out of a physical object. The nice thing about CG, obviously, is that you've got the full VR powerhouse capabilities, the kinds of things that Andy was talking about, where you're really immersed in a simulation that has the 3D sound, the 3D images. You're walking around, you can pick objects up, you can do complex tasks like fitting together different pieces of machinery. That is where we think there's, you're in the real VR territory. But obviously there's a little bit more development cost in many situations. It's come down significantly over the last few years, but you're still going to have to go ahead and find models of all the different props that you want in the scene, create what we call assets. So an asset is any kind of 3D value set that we have in this interactive virtual environment. But the nice thing is you can walk around, right? You're moving around, you can make edits to that scene. It's something that you have full control end-to-end over. And you're also able to get a little bit more data out of what people are doing. So where they're looking, what types of interactivity they had, what their head position is. So all these things are really, at the surface level there for a computer-generated experience. I'm going to go ahead and just show a little bit of an application that we built about a year ago that is illustrating a warehouse training scenario. This is Andy and our director of production, Todd, here. And this is just captured on the desktop. But what's cool is to start, just to give you guys a little bit of contextual evidence for what I'm talking about, Andy is talking in this environment in a fully 3D space. So we're moving around with the desktop here, but you can see that this is a full 3D space, captured environment, scanned and put into a virtual space. So if you're wearing a headset, you can actually fully walk around this environment, which is great, but every object needs to be modeled. Now here, what we've done is we've switched over to a 360 video. Same space, but instead of scanned, it's a video. And now we've got all of our props, which are just physical, real props that we can bring in. So what we do is we actually have Todd come in, and right around here, I'm going to skip ahead here. Todd is demonstrating in real life the actual process. So a person's getting this idea of what the fine detail is for how to properly pack that box. So once we've actually demonstrated that part, what we can do is we can then switch back to the 3D experience where there's full interactivity. And what you're about to see here is a recorded avatar of Todd. So what we actually have, something we deploy quite a bit, is just the ability in our platforms to put a headset on and record a presenter interacting with props. So Todd's not actually live for the person who is in this scene. They're just seeing a virtual representation of his past self that's been recorded. So now you can see Todd's actually picking up these virtual props. So we virtualized a headset, we virtualized the bubble wrap, and he's going through the entire training procedure in 3D. And then it's up to the individual trainee to replicate that experience. So this is a really show, tell, do type format for creating an application. And then you'll see, so this is, again, a desktop application, but it's in a headset. So you can go ahead, you can see the types of interactivity. People pick up objects, put them in a box. So this is a really nice way of kind of blending the different methodologies that are available to folks, but also hopefully illustrating for you guys what the, just visual and experiential differences between these two spaces would be and where you might want to deploy one over the other. Another example, this one is a full CG. This is actually a full surgery simulation, again, captured from desktop, but compatible with headsets, compatible with projection systems. So this is a more sophisticated application because the human body itself is a very complex thing to model. Obviously, all of these different props had to be modeled. Our team actually went and sat in and went through an entire, they would go to surgery, live surgery demos to have subject matter experts give input on the validity of the experience. So this was a very involved application development experience, but it really gives you an idea of, how sophisticated you can get on this full CG side. I mean, you can see all these props in this space, all these different things. So you can even get it to the level where you've got a haptic device controlling the types of knives or the scalpels and things like that. So just a little bit more of an idea of the kind of range of applications available to us. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague Sato in just a second here, who's going to jump in on the details of what we just saw in those two examples. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and send out our second poll. So this poll is asking us where we see the highest value for using VR training. So hopefully after a little bit of that information, it'd be really great for you all to give your input on this. We're trying to think about the ways that we see VR, having the most value, and we'd love to hear from you guys what you think as well. We're seeing a lot of answers come in here. This is great. Thank you guys so much for your input. I'll leave this open for another 15, 20 seconds. Discuss the results just a little bit. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. So it's great to see this. I think this is really a sign of the times. Remote training is far and away winning this one, with dangerous scenarios coming in at a fairly close second. Obviously, we're looking for ways that we can connect with people, teach them valuable skills while they're in isolation, while they're socially distanced from each other. And virtual reality is giving us a really awesome tool for how to do. Me at home with my own Oculus Rift, I can just jump into any application, start learning new skills. It's a fantastic way, I think, for us to really learn how to, live within this new reality that we're experiencing. Thanks everybody for your feedback on that. Really appreciate it. And like I said, feel free to submit your questions. We'll be having a detailed Q&A later. I'm going to hand it over to Sato now. Sato, it's all you.
Okay, thanks. So now I'm just going to go over some of the key components of a virtual reality training application. So I'm going to cover gathering your assets, how to instruct a trainee on a procedure, the testing part of the process, or when they're actually performing the procedure, and gauging how effective a training is. So the first step is usually the creation, gathering of the assets, whether these are like objects or your product or whatever you're being trained on. WorldViz can also assist you in the entire process, from creating 3D models to filming of 360 videos or doing photogrammetry, which I'll talk to in a second. But some resources that can be utilized for 3D models, if you want to kind of search some out on your own, you can use something like like a popular content 3D model library like Sketchfab, because this allows you to search for a lot of 3D models. You can obviously, if you have the ability to create 3D models with a 3D modeling program like Blender or 3D Studio Max. And now there's also the option for doing something called photogrammetry. So this is where you get a series of photographs of a real world object, and then this can automatically be stitched together to create a 3D model. And you could do full environments this way. And this is also something, like I said, we also provide this service as well. So we can do photogrammetry for you if you don't have the ability to be able to do that on your own. And also you might want to have some avatars that you might be using as agents or bots or representations of people in your scene. So there's a few good resources for that, like Mixamo, for this online content library, or a program like Character Creator. And there's a lot of other resources. I have some of those listed here. And then 360 videos and images. So nowadays it's pretty easy to generate 360 videos and images. So you can get anything from like $100 gear 360 to maybe a more professional like Insta Pro, or you could even use your phone and capture like a photosphere and be able to get a 360 image that way. And you can add 3D models and avatars that are rendered inside of the 360 video image as well. And so once you have your assets together, the next step is deciding how to instruct the trainee of how the procedure is supposed to be done. So there are many options for this, and they might include live trainer that's either in the simulation with the trainee or instructs them before they put on the headset. If the trainer is instructing while inside the simulation, they can be remotely located, so they could be anywhere in the world. They don't need to be in the same place. So this option might be easier than needing to instruct a trainee in person. And an even easier option is to use what Dan was talking about earlier, the recorded avatar. So this is where you can pre-record your instructions and going through the motions of how to do the training. And this includes both capturing the motion capture and voice, as well as interacting with objects. And this is a very effective option if the instructions don't change and there aren't any like dynamic changes in the instructions that may arise. You may also be able to get by with just an animation on the models without a recorded avatar. So an example of this might be if showing an animation of a series of components being placed together in the right order, and then the animation just involves kind of showing those models being combined. And to increase the realism of an instructor, you can also do what Dana showed you earlier as well, which is called we call that a rotoscoped avatar. So that's the image of this right here. So this is actually just a video that's filmed against a green screen, and then that video representation can be placed in the virtual scene seamlessly. And you can also use 2D or 360 videos placed inside here, or you can use, maybe like a 2D video that is in the simulation represented as like a TV or a video screen. In the training, if the trainee needs to ask questions or interact with the trainer and the use of a remotely located live trainer isn't feasible, another option is to have like an AI agent or bot. So this bot would need to have a series of pre-recorded responses or animations that can be accessed either through a trainee choosing from a list of questions or through the use of something like a chatbot database. So that's similar to what you might interact with on many websites nowadays before you get to a live person. And lastly, the simplest form might be just displaying a text panel or a graphical user interface that shows information and images on a flat panel. So that just kind of gives them instructions that they can just read in the simulation. And so the next phase would be when you allow a trainee to attempt the procedure. And this is the part where they are able to actually perform the actions. And if they perform the necessary actions in the correct order, then they can proceed to the next step. If something is done incorrectly, then they can be told to repeat the incorrect step and perhaps repeat the needed instructions for them. So for instance, to gauge whether items are placed in a box correctly, you can have a sensor in the box that looks for what items it intersects with and in what order. And once all the correct items have been placed, then the simulation allows you to proceed. And depending on what skill or method you're trying to teach, there may be various ways you can gauge the effectiveness of the training. So you may have a trainee repeat the training and see when they can perform the procedure with no errors in a quick fashion. If the training involves a development of a skill, you can see how that skill may be improving through virtual training and how well that skill can be applied. And over time, you may also gauge the retention of the trainee has on the material from repeated kind of run-throughs, and as well as maybe providing a questionnaire after the simulation to see what information has been retained and fully understood. And finally, you can measure a trainee's physiological responses while in the simulation to use, for instance, something like eye tracking to see where their attention is focused and generating things like heat maps and seeing kind of where they're looking. Or you can measure something like heart rate, skin conductance to see what parts of a simulation may be more anxiety producing, et cetera. And so that's kind of just a really quick overview of some of the key components. And I'm going to hand it back to Dan, who's going to do another poll. So let me get Dan back to control.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zato. I realized I actually didn't publish the last results, so I'm going to do that real quick for our last poll, which was where do you see the highest value? We had a full 50% say remote training, and then 37% dangerous scenarios. Interpersonal skill training and deploying a large scale came in a little bit further down. And again, just want to let you guys know, we are taking your questions. So any questions that you guys have, we're actually adding at the end of the presentation, and we're going to speak to those in detail. I'm going to go ahead and launch the third poll here, which I think is actually one of the most interesting poll questions that we've come up with recently, which is, what is the greatest barrier that you all, in your business, in your institution, what's the greatest barrier that you're encountering right now to getting your VR training program off the ground, right? I think this is really going to be telling about where the industry at large is. We want to know, what you as individuals are encountering. All right, this is awesome. I think this is a super valuable question for us to talk about in detail, to really kind of put our minds into as a group. So your input here is super valuable. All right, I'm going to give it one more second. Go ahead and close that out, and let's take a look at the results. So not knowing where to start is a little bit lower, which is great. I mean, I think that's telling that folks are a lot more educated about the tools that they have out there. But for you who don't know how to start, we're happy to give you guys some suggestions. There's a ton of awesome resources out there. Getting content into VR. This is the kind of classic barrier, right? It's a challenge and a cost to develop these environments. And I think these days, convincing decision makers is really, really interesting because, how can we demonstrate this? And that really goes hand in hand with the unclear return on investment. Ease of use, glad to see that that's come down quite a bit as well. So this is fantastic, everybody. Thank you so much for participating in this poll. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Felix for the live demo portion of our presentation. So it'll be exciting. We'll get to see Felix's lovely face on webcam live from Santa Barbara right now. Felix, I'm making you presenter.
All right, you should see my slide now, and let me turn on my webcam. And a quick note on that. Hey, that's me. For those of you who have watched the previous webinars, it's Felix in the Tech Lab section here talking about hardware. If you want to increase the webcam view, there's a little slider at the bottom so that you can see in a little more detail what I'm showing here. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is what options do you have for training systems, so for VR training systems. The smallest one, the most lightweight, the most compact, the cheapest solution is the standalone headset. I have an older Oculus Go here because all of our current generation headsets are out in the field right now. So you have essentially everything in here from like the rendering unit, the processing, the battery, the tracking system is all integrated in this headset. Makes it cost economical because it's fairly cheap, but it also has the most limitations in terms of like rendering power, in terms of like what hardware devices you can combine with it, in terms of how you have to build your application. So you will need to really make sure that you make a conscious decision that you want to go with like this kind of headset, or do you want to go with like a PC-based headset when you're building your VR training application. So again, cheapest solution, but also has the most limitations. And the step up is we have we built a VR system in the box. So we have the what we call the VizBox here. It's a full-fledged VR system in a Pelican case that can be shipped around the country from one trainee or from one user to the other. And on that note, in times of COVID, really important, we actually include disinfectant wipes, and so everything from the laptop to the foam itself to the headset can be disinfected before it goes to the next user. So let me show you really quick. I can take out the headset, take out the controllers here, and then I would have to plug in the power. And then all I need to do, because everything is already hooked up, I can just turn on the laptop. There's a quick calibration procedure that I have to do with the headset, but it only takes like 2 minutes. and then I'm ready to go. And I can join a remote training session, or my single user experience here. So it's a really great system. You have the full power of a gaming laptop that has a decent graphic card built in. So this is a really good solution that our customers really like. And then the next step up is essentially our corner projection system. Again, for those of you who've joined us before, they know what the corner projection system is here. I'm going to put on my tracked glasses, and I will show you our fire drill. Okay, so let me start the fire drill. So like you saw in the beginning, there are instructions here to give the trainee an idea of what they have to do. So the gentleman is coming in here and is a little clumsy and tips over those candles. Those candles fall in the stack of paper, and that starts a fire. Okay, so you see, everybody is starting to panic. People are running out. You could do the same thing, or I have actually a fire extinguisher here. So I could take the fire extinguisher, but I've never used a fire extinguisher before. So let me look the instructions really quick. Hold upright, hold the rank pin, start back by 8 feet. Okay, and aim. Let's do this. Hold the fire extinguisher out, and up. Well, good thing there's a sprinkler system that put out the fire. Unfortunately, that also meant that everything in the office, a lot of things in the office are damaged. And the paperwork that people have been working on, the electronic devices, the PCs, all of those get damaged by the entire sprinkler system going off. The nice thing about virtual reality is I can try again. So I just reset the application here. Everybody is back in their working position. And okay, let me ask the gentleman to come through again. This time I'm prepared. I know how to use the fire extinguisher, so I can just wait here until the fire starts, and I'm already calmly, while everybody else is panicking around me, remove the pin here and aim at the fire, and as you can see, no sprinkler system has been set off this time. Okay, another nice thing is at the end here, we have an overview map that shows how well I performed. So you see the little lines here, like how effectively have I aimed the fire extinguisher at the fire and put out that fire. So this is an example of a really great mixed reality training application. And next up, sorry, I have to juggle multiple devices here. And then I guess on my next slide, I'm going to show you really quick what other hardware accessories do we have. So you can build your training application and add, for example, data gloves, or if you want to increase the level of realism, add a haptic feedback suit. Like the Tesla suit is a really great device that simulates impact on your body. If you need a training application where the participant is has to cover a larger area, you can use a large scale motion tracking system, like our PPT tracking system. Or if you have multiple participants where you need each participant to animate an avatar so that they can see each other's full body in VR, you can use something like an accent suit. And then there are the interesting eye tracking data that you can collect during the training application to give the trainee feedback afterwards. Hey, this is where you were looking, and this is where you should have been looking during the training application. As well as biofeedback measurement devices, everything from heart rate monitors to full-on EEG to measure the physiological response that a trainee had in the VR simulation. All of this can be combined with your VR training application. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dan.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Felix.
So
that was great. And then I'm about to give you guys the last poll here, and then we'll hand it over to Matthias really briefly for final thoughts on the future of VR. And from there, we'll do our Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and submit them, and we'll be able to talk to them still. Here's our last poll. So this is really just, again, to kind of get an idea of where you as the audience are, get some idea. And I think also just for the other people around, it's exciting to see, where people are. Like, where am I? Am I in the, what percentile am I in terms of the development stage right now? So this is great. Thank you guys all for submitting your responses. I think the responses track with the fact that this is a webinar on how to create a VR application. So perfect. All right. Gonna leave this open for one more second just so we can get a few more people to participate. We'll go ahead and close this out now and show you all the results. So looks like the vast majority of you all are in the research stage and planning or haven't begun, which is great. This is kind of it's time to ask yourself what are the best ways that I can implement this kind of a program. And I hope that this presentation has been helping you all get some ideas about that so far. Again, we can one-on-one answer any questions you have, kind of give more insight into how we work here. And it's also great to see that so many folks are already in the development and deployment stages right now, already using applications, even building follow-up applications. So it's awesome to see that, and really happy to have you guys here. Thanks again so much for participating. I'm going to hand it over to Matthias, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap this thing up with our Q&A. Matthias, handing over to you now.
Hi there. Hope you can all hear me. Jumping in here right now. I'm talking a little bit about what we think is the future of VR training, and what we see as obstacles, and also where we think there is potential for growing faster. What's the trends that make VR training even more prominent than it is right now? So the one item that is clear right now, and that's also been clear in the polls that we did, is right now we see growing adoption of virtual reality in general, and certainly also on virtual reality training applications. And it's been driven by external factors, like currently the need to socially distance and work from home. But it's also been driven over the last 5 years by a wave of consumer VR, where people really try to use VR for gaming, and still are trying to use it for gaming, and where the devices got cheaper and better, and more affordable, which really is driving virtual reality forward. And then on top of that, even the perception that there is virtual reality and augmented reality as two methods available for expanding training capabilities has been driven over the last 5 years. I remember the early days of WorldViz, when we had a banner that said VR training, and people came to our booth and they didn't know what VR was. Well, these days, most people know what VR was. That is an acronym for virtual reality. So we see a growing adoption in the marketplace right now. The obstacles for adoption of virtual reality training are still cost, and even though the prices have come down, but in order to have a good virtual reality system, you still have to kind of put the money down that it takes to like have basically a good computer gaming system, which is somewhere in the range of like, let's say $1,500 to $3,000 per station. Unless you go like for the lightweight devices that Felix showed, but those are usually not as efficient for training because it would take a lot of effort to get your content on there. So basically for most training, we find that it's still necessary to have a good PC and to have a high-end headset, and there's a cost for that. The complexity, what I mean with that is that while like this gets easier to use now, it's still complex technology. Like reality is you're trying to get that going at home, and it will take you a little bit to kind of even understand how all the cables go together. And it will take you a little bit to kind of really start getting used to using this as a day-to-day tool. And certainly if it needs to go in a training department, then like it needs to also be incorporated in the training process. And that leads to the third point that we see, and that is really implementation. For a company to use VR AR training, it is necessary to make it part of the training process, which means the training department, the people that do training right now, need to really embrace it and start using it as one of their tools. And that leads like back to the part of the presentation that Andy was giving. Like a training really is only valuable if there is content that is meaningfully conveyed to a participant, and the participant can walk away with learning something. And in order to do that, the experts in that field are the people who have been doing training in corporations over the last hundreds of years, like the training departments, right? And those guys, like they need to be starting to kind of understand what this new technology brings to the table, and they definitely need to be part of the like design process of the training, and they also need to be part of or actually leading the process of implementing that training in a company, really driving it. So that really is important, and that is an obstacle sometimes because it requires change, and change always takes time. As far as hardware, I just want to hit that shortly. Virtual reality gear is still advancing. Like the one item that hasn't been solved yet for headsets, for head-mounted displays, is actually the fact that the focal distance in a head-mounted display is currently fixed. So the lenses are static, the focal distance is fixed. So when you're using a head-mounted display, your eyes are always looking kind of parallel, they don't cross. And that is a little weird when you look at closer stuff, right? So because it's not adjusting, it means there's a little bit of an artificial movement that your eyes have to make to use a head-mounted display, which some people find uncomfortable. And that's probably one of the reasons why we typically see virtual reality systems mostly used for training intervals that are in the range of, I would say, less than half an hour at a time. There are exceptions. There have been cases where virtual reality has been used for like 8 or 10 hours a day in certain scenarios, but that is really only when it's needed and for certain circumstances. But mostly people are using it for shorter periods of time, simply because it's not perfect, and you kind of use it, and then after you're done with it, you're happy to take the headset off again. But these things will be fixed, so that's actually great. We know that there's prototypes out there that are addressing the focal distance issue, and there's obviously it gets lighter as things keep going. Last not least, there's two things that are also improving what's available and driving things forward. One is 5G, which we're super excited right now, because specifically for remote collaboration, we have found a network connectivity to be still an issue. And you might see that even with a GoToWebinar, like what we're doing right now, we had a couple people saying, hey, they have connection issues, but there's a lot of people connected right now. So it means the connection issues are very likely on the side of the end user, on the side of the person who wants to connect. And that basically is an obstacle right now. We still see that connectivity is an issue. And certainly if it's an issue for a Skype or a GoToMeeting, then it's also an issue for virtual reality, right? So 5G will improve that. And the second thing 5G is kind of promising to do is it seems like there's like kind of companies trying to put rendering power into the 5G towers. And if that's really becoming true, then that means that your devices are going to be even more lightweight and the rendering will be even better, even more powerful. So that would be another improvement that's not out there yet, but it seems like this is something that people are planning around or thinking about, and we would be super excited if that was to happen. That would mean that your headset's lighter and can render more powerful things. And last but not least, augmented reality. Most people have heard about the HoloLens or tried it, like on this picture. Augmented reality simply allows you to insert computer-generated objects into your real space, so you still see the real world, you still can cook yourself a coffee or do whatever you're doing, but you see virtual objects floating around, and you can also collaborate if you want with remote people on those virtual objects. So that is a pretty cool way of using this technology. Currently, the augmented reality headsets are all like somewhat limited in terms of field of view, and so I would call a lot of augmented reality applications still in the early stage, but certainly it's pretty cool if you still see the real world and you can combine it with computer simulated graphics. And that was pretty much like the topics I wanted to talk about, and given we're an hour into this presentation right now, I'm handing it back to Dan. So thanks a lot for being part of this, and Dan, it's you again answering some questions here. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, everybody. Thanks again for joining us, and welcome to the Q&A session. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions. This is kind of a fun time to just go through some of the more interesting comments and questions that we got throughout the presentation. So I'll try and address these as best I can. Really kind of doing this on the fly right now. So we'll probably follow up with a little bit more detail to the individuals who asked these questions as well. So the first question that came up is the idea of 3D sound. You know, how physically realistic is the built-in simulation in our own platform, Vizard, right now? And the answer is you can get really excellent three-directional sound. We have some customers who are doing super advanced sound simulation. Vizard itself has the ability to, you know, implement binaural sound. It's definitely something that we can help you out with. Creating, you know, and having the right kind of feedback where sound is coming from the right direction is a really important key aspect of convincing simulation. So something we're happy to follow up in more detail with after this presentation. The next point is less of a question, more of a comment, but I thought it was awesome and would be really great to talk about for a second. And it's regarding the second poll. I believe one of the most important aspects is to allow children and students to see, interact, and receive training by using objects that we can't physically place or buy. This is a fantastic point, and one I think that we might have overlooked, but one that is very much present in the users and customers that we have. And that's a lot of folks are using equipment that's super expensive, things like MRI machines, you know, cranes, things along those lines. And being able to give a contextual training to a person is perfect. We actually see this a lot on the more sales and marketing use case, where folks will demonstrate products, you know, remotely or in person that they can't physically move. So, you know, a giant tractor or something along those lines. You can actually put that in a VR space and have a person go through either a training or a product demonstration. So thanks again for that super excellent point. The next one is also another really awesome, I think, an interesting point, and it regards cybersecurity. This is in response to what are the greatest barriers, and, you know, in terms of military and also business sensitive issues, how do we on the VR side ensure that proper cybersecurity considerations have been taken into account? And I think that the answer is really variable depending on the platform that you use. We are oftentimes using air-gapped systems. We actually, to address this issue specifically, developed an on-site server version of our software Beall, which is traditionally cloud-based. So it really is something that I think, even with a lot of the consumer VR headsets, because they're really focused on gathering user data or connecting to the internet, there's a whole bevy of challenges there. And really something that I think is going to be case specific. If you have cybersecurity concerns, it's really good to kind of have those in mind when you're selecting a solution. because you might be encountering things, especially if you're using some of the more consumer-focused devices and softwares, that those might not be of the preeminent concern when you're just using a gaming system, right? So let us know if you have any specific questions regarding cybersecurity. Like I said, we do have air gap solutions and things like that to address this. For the fourth item, I think this is a really interesting question, I think, for a lot of people too, is I've got some existing 3D content, in this case, drone flight instruction. How hard is it to just convert that into a VR simulation? And the answer, again, is really going to be dependent on where that content currently lives, right? If it's already in a simulation engine, something, like a game engine, it might be pretty easy if you can actually get access to the source files to just reconfigure that into a headset-compatible simulation. Might just be a hardware configuration. On the more complex end, you might be in a little bit more of a situation where you have to go and get those assets individually and reconfigure them in a VR compatible simulation style engine, right? So if you've got 3D assets, chances are it's not going to be that difficult. If you're coming from CAD, if you're coming from, BIM files, schematics, things like that, to bring that into a VR simulation. There's probably going to be a little bit of polish that needs to be done by a professional artist, but if you're bringing these 3D assets into a VR simulation, then the next challenge obviously is going to be programming the interactivity and things like that. So the long story short is good chance that it's going to be some work, but you might get lucky and find that it's already in a format that's fairly compatible, whether it's the assets or the entire simulation itself. Because those are the real two big pieces here. The programming of the interactivity and also the development of the art assets. And if you can eliminate one of those, then you're in good shape. If you can eliminate both, you're good to go. A little bit more here. I think this question, specifically this first one, is about how we would simulate the ground for a crane coming in and digging a hole. I'm going to have one of our specialists follow up with you specifically on how we might, do some material simulation. It's definitely going to be a little bit more complex on the material science side to really create a realistic ground simulation. But just I wanted to kind of point out one thing here is that you might ask yourself, is it important that this be actually scientifically valid in terms of how ground would really react? Because if the user doesn't know any better, you can actually just substitute animations. And in many cases, I think substituting an animation is going to be a lot more cost effective and have the same overall effect. You can really do a lot of smoke and mirrors stuff with VR. So say I've got this crane and I'm digging a hole, hole one is going to be somewhat sized hole, smaller, and then hole two is deeper, right? So just kind of something to keep in mind is how realistic does it need to be? Is a visual representation just going to be enough for me? Our final question here before we'll let you guys go, and looking forward to hearing your survey responses and getting some feedback on how we did here today. But the last one is the kind of one of the classic questions around VR is this user experience dizziness. How do we mitigate nausea in VR? I myself am fairly, I consider myself to be a little bit of a canary in the coal mine when it comes to this topic. If a tracking system is not really lined up, I totally understand the concern of VR sickness. But the really, I think, key piece here is making sure that you've got your things set up ahead of time, right? So if you've got a good tracking system, I think HTC Vive has a fantastic one. The Oculus Rift also, when you've got now with the Rift S, I think with the old original version of the Rift, you had to be looking at the cameras so perfectly. And if you didn't have that third camera behind you, you would start to get a little sick because you might get knocked out of place here. But now with the Rift S that's got its inside-out tracking, I would say I never encounter this anymore. So as the tracking technology has gotten better, this has really been mitigated. Another thing that people kind of think, and this goes hand in hand with the sort of like ideal video game world, is that you would just be able to pick up an Xbox controller and run through a simulation with a joystick. And I think anybody who's ever done that, unless you've got, you know, some kind of crazy ability to get through, you know, a very nauseating experience, would find that that was very uncomfortable. So a real key part about reducing dizziness is making sure your hardware is the right type of hardware. I think 3 degrees of freedom type hardware like Oculus Go's might have a little bit more tendency because you don't when you move your head forward. It's basically anything where the world and your physical movement are not matched up, whether that's navigation or the actual headset itself. So I know it's a little bit of a convoluted answer, but the idea really is, you know, if you can implement a good way of navigating the virtual experience and your hardware is also really secure in the way that it's corresponding to your physical movements, then you're pretty much set. You know, I think that's really the best answer we can give just kind of at this moment. But you know, again, thank you everybody so much for joining. I think unless anybody else has anything to say, then I'm going to close this out. Thanks again for joining us on another WorldViz webinar. Looking forward to seeing your responses to the survey, and thanks again, everybody. Hope to see you again soon.